Some stories are not about monsters, legends, or mysteries hiding in the dark. Some stories are about people who were ignored for too long. This is a true lifestyle story about isolation, quiet dependence, and the unseen damage caused when help disappears. What begins as a strange presence behind a lonely trailer slowly turns into a painful lesson about responsibility, fear, and human connection. A woman labeled as something other than human. A man who thought distance meant respect. And a fragile balance that breaks the moment kindness is withdrawn. This story is not about what she was called. It is about what she was losing. What happens when someone who is barely holding on is left completely alone. Read carefully because this story doesn't start with chaos. It starts with silence. Mark lived in a place most people only pass through. His trailer sat at the far edge of an old rural campground, where the road thinned into dirt and the trees leaned close, as if listening. The campground used to be busy years ago, but now only a few long-term residents remained, people who preferred quiet, distance, and not being asked questions. Mark was one of them. He was in his early 40s, worked odd construction jobs when he could find them, and spent most evenings sitting on the small wooden steps outside his trailer. From there, he could see the tree line stretching behind his property. Dense woods, dark even during the day. At night, they became something else entirely. That was where she lived. No one knew her real name, and no one asked. Around the campground in nearby town, people called her the Wolf Girl. It wasn't because she claimed to be an animal or wore anything strange. It was because of how she moved, how she watched from a distance, and the sound she made when she thought no one was listening. Mark first noticed her about a year earlier. He had been taking trash to the large dumpster near the woods when he saw movement between the trees. At first, he thought it was a deer. Then he saw a person, thin, dirty hair, tangled and hanging down her face. She froze when she realized she had been seen. They stared at each other for a long moment, neither speaking. Mark didn't follow her. He didn't call out. Something about her fear felt sharp, like a warning. He simply nodded once and walked back to his trailer. After that, he began noticing signs. Footprints near the edge of the campground, scraps of cloth caught on branches. Empty cans moved from where he knew he'd left them. Once late at night, he heard a long, low sound coming from the woods. It wasn't quite a howl, but it wasn't a scream either. It made the hair on his arms stand up. The other residents noticed too, but they reacted differently. Some laughed it off, some complained. A few were openly afraid. "She's not right," one man said at the communal water pump. "People like that bring trouble." Another woman claimed the wolf girl watched her children from the trees. No one could confirm it, but the story spread anyway. Mark didn't join in those conversations, kept his thoughts to himself. He had lived long enough to know that when people don't understand something, they turn it into a story. Stories are easier than truth. Over time, Mark began leaving small things near the tree line behind his trailer. A loaf of bread, a bottle of water, an old blanket folded neatly. He never saw her take them, but they were always gone by morning. He told himself he was just being practical. Someone was living out there. They needed food. That was all. Once he caught a glimpse of her in daylight. She stood half hidden behind a tree, watching him repair a broken fence panel. Her face was thin, eyes wide, and alert.
Ow.
She didn't look dangerous. She looked exhausted. "Food's there," Mark said quietly, not turning toward her. "You can take it." She didn't respond, but when he checked later, the food was gone. Weeks turned into months. This became their silent agreement. Mark never tried to talk to her. He never followed her into the woods. She never came closer than the edge of the trees. At night, he still heard the sounds sometimes, but they seemed calmer, less frantic. The other campers noticed the noises fading. "Guess she moved on," someone said. Mark wasn't so sure. There were nights when he sat outside, listening, feeling like the woods were holding their breath. He wondered who she was before this. What had pushed her so far away from people that the forest felt safer? But wondering was as far as he let himself go. Then things in Mark's own life began to change. Work dried up for the winter. Money became tight. Started taking day labor farther away, waking before sunrise and coming home late and sore. The small routine he had built checking the edge of the woods, leaving supplies began to feel like another responsibility he couldn't afford. One evening, after a long day, he noticed the food he'd left untouched from the night before. The bread was still there, damp with dew. The water bottle hadn't moved. Maybe she really did leave, he muttered. The thought brought relief and discomfort at the same time. Over the next few days, he stopped leaving food. Not all at once, just less often. Then not at all. Each time he told himself the same thing. She didn't want help. She was dangerous. It wasn't his place. The campground grew quieter, too quiet. The sounds from the woods didn't stop completely, but they changed. They became sharper. Short bursts of noise that ended suddenly, like something cutting itself off. Mark tried not to listen. One night, he woke up to scratching sounds against the back of his trailer. Light, uneven, not strong enough to be an animal. He lay still, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling. The scratching stopped. The next morning, he found marks on the siding, shallow, frantic lines. It's not deep enough to damage anything, but clear enough to be seen. He stood there for a long time, staring at them. That day, at the water pump, someone mentioned seeing movement near Mark's trailer late at night. "You sure it's safe back there?" the man asked. Mark shrugged. Probably a raccoon. But he knew it wasn't. As days passed, unease settled over the campground. Trash bins were overturned more often. Someone reported missing clothes from a line. Another claimed they heard crying near the woods. Still, no one called for help. Not yet. Mark avoided the tree line now. He told himself it was smart. He told himself distance was safer for both of them. But late at night, when he lay awake, he remembered her eyes. The way she had stood there, waiting, trusting him not to hurt her. He hadn't hurt her. He just left her alone. And as the nights grew colder and the woods grew louder, Mark began to sense that whatever balance had once existed behind his trailer was breaking slowly, quietly, and without anyone ready to stop it. The silence didn't last the way Mark expected. At first he thought the woods had finally settled, that whatever strange phase had passed. The nights were still cold, still dark, but the long sounds from the trees came less often. That should have made him feel better. Instead, it made him uneasy. Silence, he learned, could be louder than noise. A few days after he stopped leaving food, Mark noticed the trash behind his trailer had been disturbed. The lid of the bin was open, tipped backward. Scraps were scattered across the dirt. He cleaned it up without thinking too much about it. Animals did that all the time. That was normal. But the next morning, it happened again. This time, the trash was pulled farther away, closer to the tree line. Footprints marked the ground. Not animal prints. Bare feet. Small, uneven, like the person walking had been tired or unsteady. Mark stood there longer than he meant to, his breath fogging the air. He felt a tight pull in his chest, something close to regret, but he pushed it down. She chose this, he told himself. I didn't. Later that afternoon, he drove into town for supplies. The cashier, a woman who had lived there her whole life, looked at him carefully. You still living out by the old campground? She asked. Yeah, Mark said. You heard anything strange lately? Mark hesitated. What kind of strange? She lowered her voice. People say someone's been wandering near the road at night. Barefoot, talking to herself. Mark paid quickly and left without asking more. That night, the sounds returned. Louder than before, not the low, distant noises he had grown used to, but sharp bursts that cut through the air. A cry that stopped suddenly. Then another. Mark sat on his bed, hands resting on his knees, staring at the closed door. He didn't go outside. The next morning, his neighbor, an older man named Cliff, knocked on his door. You hear that last night? Cliff asked. Mark nodded. Scared my dog half to death, Cliff said. Something's wrong back there. Mark said nothing. By the end of the week, everyone in the campground was talking. Some said the wolf girl had gone mad. Others claimed there were more people hiding in the woods. A few suggested calling the authorities, but no one wanted to be the one to make that call. People who lived on the edges of places learned not to invite attention. Mark felt the eyes of others on him more often now. His trailer sat closest to the woods. Whatever was happening back there, it touched his space first. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Mark noticed movement behind the trees. A figure pacing back and forth, not hiding anymore. He watched from his steps, heart pounding. She looked thinner than before. Her movements were sharp, restless. She stopped suddenly and turned toward his trailer, staring straight at him. For a moment, neither moved. Mark raised a hand, unsure why. She took a step forward, then another, stopping just before the open ground. Her mouth moved, but he couldn't hear the words. "Go back," Mark said quietly, though he wasn't sure she could hear him either. She stood there for a long time before turning away. That night, Mark dreamed of knocking sounds that never ended. Over the next few days, small things around his trailer changed. Tools he left outside were moved. A chair was turned over. Once, he found a line scratched into the dirt, running from the woods to the back of his steps, as if someone had dragged a stick again and again. He started locking his door. Guilt crept in during the quiet moments. He remembered the calm routine they once had. How the sounds had softened when she knew food would be there. How she never came close, never asked for more. He had assumed she didn't need him. Now, it felt like she was unraveling, piece by piece. One afternoon, Mark found a burned patch of ground near the tree line. Blackened leaves. A smell of smoke still hanging in the air. She had tried to make a fire and failed. Or maybe she hadn't cared if it failed. That scared him more than anything else. A few nights later, shouting broke out near the road. Someone had seen her stumble into the light of a passing truck. The driver slammed the brakes and yelled. She vanished back into the trees before anyone could get close. The campground buzzed with fear after that. "This can't keep going," someone said. "She's going to hurt herself," another replied. Mark listened, silent, knowing they were right. That night, the crying came closer than ever before. Right behind his trailer, soft at first, then rising and falling, uneven and raw. Mark sat on the floor with his back against the wall, hands pressed over his ears. He didn't sleep. At dawn, he found something that made his stomach drop. The old blanket he had once left out, months ago, lay near the steps. Torn, mud-stained, left where he couldn't miss it. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. Mark picked it up and stood there, the cold air biting his hands. He realized then that leaving her alone hadn't meant freedom. It had meant abandonment. Whatever fragile stability she had built around that small, quiet help was gone. He didn't know what to do. He only knew that things were getting worse, and that pretending otherwise was no longer possible. Behind his trailer, the woods felt restless, as if holding something on the edge of breaking. And for the first time since he had met her eyes in the trees, Mark understood that ignoring a problem didn't make it disappear. It only gave it room to grow. Mark didn't sleep much after that. The nights felt longer now, stretched thin by worry and sound. Every small noise made him sit up. The wind through the trees no longer sounded natural. It felt restless, like something searching. For days, he told himself he would go into the woods, just to look, just to check. But each morning, fear stopped him. Fear of what he might find, and fear of what he might be expected to do after. The campground changed too. People spoke less. Doors stayed shut longer. Children were kept close. Even during the day, the place felt tense, like everyone was waiting for something bad to happen. Mark noticed her again one afternoon. She stood farther out than before, near a broken fence post by the tree line. She didn't hide this time. Her hair hung loose and tangled, her clothes torn and dirty. She swayed slightly, as if standing still took effort. Mark stepped off his trailer porch before he could stop himself. He said, keeping his voice low and calm. She flinched. Her eyes darted around, then locked onto his face. There was no anger there, just fear. Deep and endless. "You shouldn't be here," Mark said, unsure why those were the words that came out. "It's not safe." She laughed softly, a short sound with no joy in it. Then she spoke, her voice rough, unused. "Nothing is." The words hit him harder than he expected. He took a step closer. She stepped back immediately, her hands rising as if to protect herself. "Okay," Mark said quickly. "I'm not coming closer." They stood there like that, separated by a few yards of dirt and broken grass. He noticed how thin she was now, how her arms shook slightly, how her eyes never stopped moving. "You hungry?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Then she nodded once. Mark went back inside and returned with food and water. He placed them on the ground and stepped back again. She watched him the entire time. Only when he turned away did she move, grabbing the items and retreating toward the trees. "Wait," Mark said before he could think better of it. She paused. "I'm sorry," he said. The words felt small, shouldn't have stopped. She stared at him for a long moment, then shook her head slowly. People always stop. Then she disappeared into the woods. That night, a storm rolled in. Wind tore through the trees, rain pounding hard against the roof of the trailer. Mark lay awake, imagining her out there with no shelter, no warmth. The thought twisted his stomach. In the early hours of the morning, he heard shouting, not distant this time. Close, confused, angry, frightened. Mark pulled on his boots and grabbed a flashlight. His heart raced as he stepped outside. Rain soaked his clothes instantly. The beam of light cut through the darkness, catching broken branches, mud scattered debris. "Hello!" he called. The shouting turned into crying. He followed the sound deeper into the trees than he ever had before. The ground sloped downward into a small clearing. What he saw there made him stop cold. Her shelter was gone. What little she had built was destroyed. Charred wood, torn fabric, mud everywhere. The smell of smoke and wet ash hung heavy in the air. She sat on the ground. Near the remains, knees pulled to her chest, rocking slightly. She didn't look up when he approached. "I didn't mean to scare you," Mark said softly. She laughed again, sharper this time. "Everything scares me." He crouched a few feet away, keeping distance. "What happened here?" "Fire got away," she said, like everything else. Her hands were shaking badly now. She rubbed them together, then pressed them to her head. "They're watching," she whispered. "Who's watching?" Mark asked. She looked at him suddenly, eyes wide. "Everyone." Mark felt a chill run through him that had nothing to do with the rain. He realized then how far she had slipped. The careful distance, the quiet routines they had been holding her together. Without them, her thoughts had turned against her. "We need to get you somewhere safe," Mark said gently. "No," she said immediately, scrambling backward. "No places, no rooms, no doors." He didn't argue. He just sat there with her as the rain soaked them both. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the woods heavy and quiet. Mark walked back to the campground to get help. His hands shook as he dialed the number he had been avoiding for weeks. When he returned, she was gone. Panic rose in his chest. He searched the area, calling her, pushing through brush and mud. After nearly an hour, he found her near the road, crouched behind a fallen sign. Cars passed by without slowing. She could get hurt, Mark told the responders when they arrived. "She's not well. She needs help." He approached slowly, speaking calmly. She fought at first, crying out, trying to pull away. Mark stood nearby, helpless, watching as they guided her into safety. She looked back at him once. Not angry, just tired. After they left, the woods felt empty in a way Mark had never felt before. The campground returned to its usual quiet, but it no longer felt peaceful. Mark sat on his steps that evening, staring at the tree line. He understood now that kindness wasn't only about giving. It was about staying. It's about not walking away when someone depended on you, even quietly. He had thought leaving her alone was respecting her choice. Now he knew the truth. Sometimes being left alone isn't freedom. Sometimes it's the beginning of falling apart. The days after she was taken away felt unreal to Mark. The campground went back to its usual routine. But it felt hollow, like a place pretending nothing had happened. People still walked their dogs. Someone still fixed a broken fence. The wind still moved through the trees. But the woods behind Mark's trailer were quiet in a way that felt final. No footsteps. No distant sounds. No movement at the tree line. Mark kept expecting to see her standing there, watching from the shadows. Each time he looked and saw nothing, his chest tightened. 2 days later, a plain car pulled up near his trailer. A woman stepped out, followed by a man carrying a folder. They looked official, but not threatening. The woman introduced herself calmly and asked if they could talk. They sat at Mark's small table inside the trailer. The heater hummed softly, filling the pauses. "We're trying to understand what happened," the woman said. "You had contact with her longer than anyone else around here." Mark nodded. "I didn't know her name. I didn't ask." "That's okay," the man said. "We have some information now." He told him pieces of her story, slowly, carefully. She wasn't from far away. Years earlier, she had lived in a nearby town. She had worked small jobs, stayed quiet, kept to herself. Then something had gone wrong. A situation she didn't feel safe in. She left suddenly and never came back. At first, people thought she'd moved on. But she hadn't. She hid. Slept in abandoned places. Learned how to avoid attention. Every bad experience made her trust people less. Over time, the world began to feel like a threat instead of a place. "Living like that changes how someone thinks," the woman said, "especially when they're alone for too long." Mark listened, his hands clasped tightly together. "She built routines," the man continued. "Small ones, predictable ones. When those disappeared, everything else collapsed." Mark swallowed hard. He knew exactly what they meant. "She talked about you," the woman added. Mark looked up sharply. "What did she say?" "That you were quiet. That you didn't push. That when the food stopped coming, she thought she'd done something wrong." The words hit him harder than anything else. After they left, Mark sat alone for a long time. He stared at the same wall he had leaned against during the nights of crying. He replayed every moment he had chosen to turn away. Every time he told himself it wasn't his responsibility, he had thought distance was kindness. A week later, Mark was asked to visit the facility where she was staying. He almost said no. Fear rose in him again. Fear of seeing the damage too clearly. But guilt pushed him forward. The place wasn't cold or harsh like he had imagined. It was quiet, clean, bright in a gentle way. The staff spoke softly, moved slowly. "She's still very guarded," a counselor told him. "But she's eating. Sleeping some. That's progress." Mark waited in a small room with plain chairs and a window that looked out onto a courtyard. When she entered, he barely recognized her. She was clean now. Wrapped in warm clothes, her hair tied back. She still looked fragile, but her eyes were clearer. She stopped when she saw him. "You came," she said. "I said I would," Mark replied. They sat across from each other. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't as heavy as before. "I thought you left because I failed," she said quietly. Mark shook his head. "No, I was afraid, and I made the wrong choice." She looked at her hands. "People always leave when it gets hard." "I shouldn't have," he said. "I'm sorry." She didn't forgive him right away. She didn't need to. Instead, she asked questions about the woods, the trailer, the trees behind it. Simple things. Familiar things. "They're helping me understand what happened," she said. "Why I broke apart." You didn't break. You were carrying too much alone." The visit was short. When it ended, she didn't look back this time. But she didn't seem afraid either. As weeks passed, more of her story became known. Not as gossip, not as legend, but as truth. She had never been wild, never dangerous. She had been overwhelmed, lost, and unseen. The name people had given her faded quickly once the truth surfaced. Without mystery, there was only a human being who had needed help. The campground changed after that. People talked more quietly. Some admitted they should have spoken up sooner. Others avoided the subject entirely. Mark changed too. He stopped sitting on his steps at night. Instead, he volunteered where he could. He spoke when something felt wrong. He learned that staying silent wasn't the same as staying out of the way. One evening, months later, he walked to the edge of the woods. The trees looked the same as always, but the feeling was different now. No tension. No waiting. Just stillness. He realized then that the hardest part wasn't the fear he had felt when things went wrong. It was knowing that a small act of consistency, something he had once offered without thinking, had meant the difference between stability and collapse for someone else. and that walking away, even quietly, could change a life forever. Mark stood there until the sun dipped below the trees. Then he turned back toward his trailer, carrying a lesson he knew he would never forget. Sometimes the truth behind a story isn't dramatic or strange. Sometimes it's simply about what happens when a person is left alone for too long and what it costs when someone who could have stayed chooses not to. Life did not suddenly become peaceful after everything ended. For Mark, it became quieter on the outside and heavier on the inside. The kind of quiet that makes you think too much. The kind that follows you even when you are busy. The woods behind his trailer stayed empty. No movement. No sounds at night. At first, Mark thought that was a good thing. That meant no danger, no fear. But after a while, the silence felt wrong. It reminded him of how close he had come to pretending nothing was happening. People at the campground slowly returned to their routines. Conversations shifted to other topics. Broken fences got fixed. Someone painted their trailer. Life moved on the way it always does when a crisis passes. But Mark noticed small changes. People were kinder in quiet ways. Someone left extra food at the shared table with a note that said, "Take what you need." A neighbor checked on an older man who lived alone. Parents watched their children more carefully, not just out of fear, but out of awareness. No one talked about her much anymore. Not because they didn't care, but because they finally understood she wasn't a story to tell. She was a person who had been hurting. Mark visited her a few more times over the next months. Each visit showed small improvements. She spoke more clearly. She laughed once, surprised by the sound of it. She still struggled, still had days when she withdrew, but she wasn't alone anymore. On one visit, she asked him a question that stayed with him. "Why did you help me at all?" she asked. Mark thought for a long moment. "Because I saw you," he said finally. "And I didn't want to pretend I hadn't." She nodded slowly, like she was storing that answer somewhere safe. One afternoon, she told him she was learning how to live indoors again. How to sleep with walls around her. How to trust doors instead of fear them. It wasn't easy, but she was trying. "You didn't fail me," she said quietly. "You just didn't know how much you mattered." Mark left that day feeling lighter and sadder at the same time. Back at the campground, he made changes in his own life. Small ones, but steady. He stopped isolating himself so much. He talked more, asked questions, listened when something felt off. He learned that responsibility didn't always mean fixing everything. Sometimes it meant not walking away. The trailer behind him remained the same, but the space no longer felt like a border between safety and danger. It felt like a reminder. Some nights Mark still sat outside, but now he faced the woods without fear. He remembered how easy it had been to label something as strange instead of understanding it. How quick people were to turn discomfort into distance. He thought about how many others might be living quietly on the edges of places. Holding themselves together with fragile routines, no one noticed. Winter passed. Then spring. The woods came alive again with normal sounds, birds, wind, distant movement. Nothing unsettling. Just life continuing. One day, Mark received a short letter. It wasn't long, just a few lines. She wrote that she was moving into a shared living space. That she was nervous, but hopeful. That she was learning how to ask for help before everything fell apart. At the end, she wrote, "Thank you for seeing me as human when I couldn't." Mark folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. The campground never became famous. No news trucks came. No stories went viral. And that was okay. The truth didn't need attention to matter. What stayed behind was something quieter and more important: awareness. Mark understood now how thin the line was between coping and collapsing. How easily someone could slip through without noise. How silence could be mistaken for strength. He also understood something else. Helping someone didn't require heroism. It required consistency, presence, the choice to stay even when it was uncomfortable. Years later, when new people moved into the campground, Mark sometimes noticed others who kept to themselves too much. When he did, he didn't assume. He didn't label. He checked in. Not with pressure, not with force, just with kindness, because he had learned the hard way. That being left alone can feel like freedom at first, but for someone already breaking, it can feel like the end. And sometimes, the difference between surviving and falling apart is one person who decides not to look away. The woods behind the trailer were just woods again. But for Mark, they would always be a reminder of what happens when people become stories. Instead of humans and what can change when someone chooses to see the truth instead,